cries of gulls, salty wind, permeated with the smoke of bonfires. On the coast of the North Atlantic, where even in summer the breath of ice does not leave the air, men in furs cut meat with long knives. 9 months without fresh catch, without hunting, without a chance to find living meat. And yet they survive. How? Why did a piece of meat hung under the roof of their homes not rot, even by spring? And what did these warriors know about food preservation that most of us don't know today? The answer is hidden in their smoky homes, and in one simple yet ingenious word. Archaeologists found beneath Viking settlements in Iceland and on the coast of Norway traces of smoked bones. Traces from centuries when meat was stored not in cold, but in smoke. These findings confirm that the Vikings possessed a method that allowed them to preserve meat for up to 9 months, and without any glaciers or caves. Historians write that this technology was so perfect that the meat remained edible even after long sea voyages. They called such provisions by the word hangikjöt, literally hung meat. This term became a symbol of their culinary survival. Essentially, this was meat dried and permeated with smoke to such an extent that time ceased to have power over it. Imagine, no, feel, the smell of pine smoke penetrating the flesh, drops of fat sizzling on hot stones. This was not just food, it was armor against winter. Each piece hung under the roof of a longhouse where the hearth never went out. Inside it was dark, damp, and smoky, but it was precisely in this suffocating air that hope for spring was born. To achieve such a result, an understanding of the nature of fire and wind was needed. A Viking's home was structured like a respiratory organ. Smoke rose to the roof and enveloped the meat, giving bacteria no chance. Thus, the effect of a natural smokehouse was created. Essentially, their entire home transformed into a refrigerator made of smoke. But this was only the first layer of their secret. After all, Vikings didn't just dry meat. They subjugated the elements. They knew that too strong a heat would kill the taste, and too weak a heat would not protect. Therefore, they chose wood with a special aroma, most often birch or juniper. Juniper, by the way, acted as a natural antiseptic. Its resins not only imparted a bittersweet taste to the meat, but also killed bacteria. This method was not just a way to preserve food, it was a ritual. Meat hung alongside weapons, dried over the same smoke that warmed their children. In these plumes of smoke, life and death, warmth and cold, strength and survival merged. But how did they determine when the meat was ready? Surprisingly, they relied not on time, but on sound and smell. The elders would say, "When the meat stops dripping and starts to sing," that's what they called the moment when the smoke completely permeated the fibers. Now it seems impossible to live through winter without a refrigerator, but the Vikings did it year after year. Their homes became factories of survival, where every board, every crack in the roof was part of the system, and yet smoking was only the beginning. After all, not all meat could be stored in smoke, and the sea did not always provide fish. Then the Vikings resorted to another, even older method, preservation by the power of wind and salt. And it was there, on the border between land and sea, that they invented what later became a symbol of northern taste and martial resilience. On the gray shore of the North Sea, the wind lashed as if it wanted to tear off skin. A Viking stood knee-deep in icy water and threw pieces of meat, generously covered with salt, into the sea, not for sacrifice to the gods, but for life. Salt was their second weapon against rot, their chemistry before chemistry existed. They called it vitagull, white gold. And this was no poetic exaggeration. Salt cost more than silver, and every grain of it could decide the fate of an entire settlement. Historians write that in northern villages, salt was extracted by evaporating seawater in clay vessels. This process was long and required considerable effort. Several days by the fire to obtain just a handful of white crystals. Salt not only preserved meat, it transformed it into a hard, aromatic energy reserve that could last for months, even in warm weather. Archaeological finds in York and Trøndelag show traces of large salt pits and charred cauldrons, evidence that the Norsemen not only knew how to work with salt, but did so on an industrial scale. The Vikings used a method later called dry salting. Pieces of meat were laid in layers, sprinkled with salt, and left in pits lined with stones. After several days, the meat began to weep, releasing moisture that drained into the ground, leaving a dense, firm texture. They called this process blodrenning, which can be translated as meat bleeding. And if smoking provided smoke and aroma, salt provided eternity. The sensory image here is almost painful. The heavy smell of salt, wet skin frozen in the cold, fingers burned by brine. Salt corroded not only the meat, but also their hands. But it was the smell of certainty, the smell of power over death. When the sea was locked in ice in winter, when livestock had long been slaughtered, it was these salted layers that became salvation. The term without which this stage cannot be understood is lactobacilli. Today, we know that with proper salting, it was these beneficial microorganisms that began to act in the meat, displacing dangerous ones. But for the Vikings, this was magic. They saw that meat, having lain in salt, did not spoil, and believed that salt sucked out evil. In their mythology, salt was often associated with purity. It's no wonder it was sprinkled on sacrifice sites to appease the gods. However, salt was a rarity, and then the wind came into play. On coastal cliffs where fishermen spread their nets, rows of meat could be seen hanging on wooden poles. The wind dried it, transforming it into what would later be called cured meat. In the north, this method was called skerpikjöt, literally sharp meat. It hung for weeks, swaying in the wind, darkening, becoming hard as stone. But inside, it retained fat and flavor. According to archaeological data found in Iceland, Vikings built special barns without walls, open to the wind but protected from rain. Meat hung there for up to 6 weeks. Nature did the rest. No additives, no technology. Only air, sun, and patience. This was the world's first dry refrigerator. The sound that every child raised in such homes remembered was the rustle of suspended pieces. When the wind passed through them, they made a dull tapping sound. Meat knocked against meat, like wooden planks, and this sound meant, winter is coming, but we are ready. Dried meat was not just food. It was a strategic unit. During campaigns, when Viking ships were away for months, it was these provisions they took with them. One piece could weigh less than half a kilogram, but provided energy for a whole day. Warriors wrapped it in woolen cloths to prevent it from absorbing moisture and ate it right at the oars when there was no time to light a fire. Modern research shows that the protein content in such meat was almost 30% higher than in fresh. That is, the longer it hung, the more nutritious it became. Perhaps this is why Vikings could endure exhausting treks of 50 kilometers a day without losing strength. And yet, even salt and wind did not always save them. A wet autumn, rains, decay, all of this could destroy months of labor. And then the Norsemen devised a third, almost mystical method: fermentation. They allowed the meat to die in a controlled manner, only to resurrect its flavor later. This stage became the boundary between survival and the alchemy of taste. Indeed, according to archaeologists, it was the Vikings' fermented products that survived centuries, leaving us the smell of that era, pungent, sour, yet surprisingly alive. When the sun in northern latitudes barely touched the horizon, and the day lasted no longer than a short breath, the Vikings began a process that today would be called a biochemical miracle. They allowed meat to spoil, but not completely. In their understanding, this was a sacred boundary between the death and life of the product, between decay and preservation. They called this method rotna, ripening. In our time, scientists would call it fermentation. Historians write that this very process was at the heart of the famous Icelandic dish hakarl, fermented shark, as well as skata, aged skate. But what now seems like gastronomic madness was, in that era, a matter of survival. Meat that underwent natural fermentation required neither smoke, nor salt, nor ice. All that was needed was time, earth, and control. The Vikings buried meat in the ground, or placed it in wooden barrels lined with seaweed and grass. They covered it with stones from above to prevent air from entering. This created an anaerobic environment, without oxygen. Bacteria living inside the meat slowly began to process proteins and fats, changing their structure. This transformed the flesh into something that could be stored for months. Today we understand that this process was accompanied by the formation of ammonia, which repelled insects and protected the product. But back then, the Vikings simply knew the smell was terrible, but the meat remained alive. Archaeological studies in Iceland and the Faroe Islands show remnants of pits with bones and organic matter, structurally similar to fermented products. Scientists suggest that similar methods were applied not only to fish, but also to lamb, horse meat, and even the meat of seabirds. And although this method was dangerous, the slightest error in temperature could cost a life. It provided what smoke and salt could not: independence. The image of this process is almost ritualistic. Night, frozen ground. A man in a fur cloak lowers his hands into a cold pit, inhaling the sharp, Swedish smell of decay. Somewhere nearby, the wind howls. In the distance, metal clangs. Weapons are being forged. And above it all, silence, because even breathing seems superfluous. This is not just food preparation. It is a dialogue with nature, with its shadow and light. The term that reflects the essence of what was happening is anaerobic fermentation. For modern man, chemistry; for the Viking, the will of the gods. For they believed that Odin taught people the art of preserving meat so that they could go on campaigns without fearing hunger. Sagas mention meat that does not rot, served at a feast when supplies had long run out. Perhaps these were the first mentions of fermented products. The taste of such meat was sharp, almost poisonous. A contemporary person would not be able to swallow a single piece, but for a Viking, it was the taste of victory over time. Each portion meant that the tribe would endure winter. Fermentation was a dangerous art. If the meat soured too much, poison appeared. Therefore, knowledge was passed down through generations, from father to son, from mother to daughter. Each family had its own recipe, its own ratio of herbs, salt, and air. In the smells of fermentation, fear and hope mingled. One wrong step, and the whole winter would be for naught. But if done correctly, the meat could be stored until spring, and sometimes longer. Archaeologists found remains of burial pits where Vikings placed pieces of fermented meat as offerings to the dead. This was a symbol of strength and abundance, food that conquers death. The sensory perception of this food was almost mythological. It was written that the air around such pits was so pungent that it could be cut with a knife. But it was this smell that became a symbol of survival. Today, residents of Iceland still prepare hakarl, and this recipe has remained almost unchanged for 1,000 years. They continue to do what their ancestors began, challenging nature with the help of nature itself. But even this method, so reliable, was not the limit of their skill. For in the north, there was not always meat, and the seas were not always merciful. And then the Vikings found a way to preserve not only food, but also the energy of life, in fats and bones. This step transformed them from mere survivors into true masters of northern alchemy. The fire dies down, but the fat still boils. In huge cauldrons, black with soot, the Vikings cooked what saved them, even when there was no fish or livestock left. From the remnants of bones and fat, They created a substance they called smør, not just butter, but a concentrate of life. It was not a product, but fuel. Modern historians compare it to a medieval energy bar, light, fatty, long-lasting, and capable of replacing an entire meal. Animal fat, what modern humans discard, was a gift from the gods for the Vikings. They rendered it, strained it through cloth, and stored it in sealed leather bags. In this form, it did not spoil for months. According to archaeological findings in York and Birka, vessels with solidified fat are found alongside fish bones and meat, meaning it was taken on voyages. It was the basis of their expeditionary diet. Here a key term emerges, rendered fat, in Old Norse talg. Unlike butter, it contained no moisture, meaning it could not go rancid. The Vikings used it not only for food, but also for lighting, lubricating weapons, and protecting skin. It was a universal source of strength and warmth. In conditions of perpetual cold, it was the equivalent of gold, something that could not be lost. Visually, this process resembled alchemy. Smoke rose above the cauldrons. An amber-colored layer shimmered on the surface, and when it was skimmed off with wooden spoons, it flowed like molten wax. The taste was rich, sweetish, smoky. This fat was mixed with pieces of dried meat or blood, creating a dish known as blodpudding, blood stew. It was a symbol of returning to life, as each spoonful provided strength after days of travel. Archaeologists found remnants of such energy mixtures even at the bottom of ships. They lay in clay vessels sealed with beeswax. Beeswax, by the way, acted as a sealant and antiseptic, another discovery of the Norsemen. Historians believe that, thanks to it, fat could be stored for up to 9 months, precisely the length of the cycle from one hunt to the next. The sensory image, the thick smell of rendered fat absorbed into the walls of the house, the warm light reflected in its gleaming surface, meat, salt, smoke, and fat, the 4 elements of survival. Together, they created not just a diet, but a system where every drop had meaning. It was a unique northern code passed down through generations. But within this simplicity lay engineering genius. To prevent the fat from going rancid, the Vikings added juniper berries or sorrel. These plants contain natural acids and oils that prevent spoilage. Modern research confirms such additives indeed extend shelf life. What they did intuitively is now confirmed in the laboratory. Sometimes fat was mixed with flour and honey, creating nutritious balls, prototypes of modern field rations. This product was called sviðabolur. Warriors could even carry it with them on campaigns, a sword in one hand, a piece of concentrated energy in the other. Legends said that one such ball could sustain strength for a whole day. And, if chronicles are to be believed, it was on such provisions that great voyages were built, from Norway to the shores of Vinland, the land later called America. The term describing this principle is preservation through fat. In modern understanding, the hermetic sealing of nutrients in an oxygen-free environment. For the Vikings, this was akin to magic. For fire, having taken life from a beast, now granted it again, in the form of a gleaming aromatic elixir. But behind all these techniques lay one grand idea, a balance between the elements. They knew, if you use too much salt, the meat will turn to stone. If you give too much smoke, you will lose the taste. If you overcook the fat, you will lose your life. This was not a random collection of techniques. It was a philosophy of survival built on precision and respect for nature. And so, when their ships sailed into the fog and their homes remained empty, meat still hung on the crossbeams under the roofs. It jingled in the wind like bronze bells. Every sound meant one thing. Even if the sea did not return the men, their families would not starve. And this chime was the quietest, yet most powerful song of the North. However, the final test was not on land or in the home. It awaited them on the open sea, where time stretched into infinity and hope could perish with a single wave. There, amidst the cold and darkness, the Vikings put their knowledge to the ultimate test, when meat, smoke, and fat became not just food, but the boundary between life and death. Night. A storm. The sea roars like a beast, and waves crash against the wooden sides of the longship. In the hold, darkness, dampness, and the smell of sweat, smoke, and fat. This is not an aroma. It is a testament to survival. Here, below deck, lie bags of meat wrapped in cloth, vessels of fat carefully sealed with wax, and bundles of dried fish clattering like bones. These provisions are the result of months of labor, and every crumb counts. The Vikings knew, if the food spoiled, death would come before the enemy. Viking voyages lasted weeks, sometimes months. Historians note that during journeys to the coast of Britain or Iceland, each warrior received about half a kilogram of meat or fish per day. And this was not fresh produce. It was all dried, salted, permeated with smoke or fat. But it was this meat, heavy, hard, almost odorless, that gave them the strength to row for hours and to fight when the ship touched foreign land. The term that accurately describes their diet is combat ration. Modern armies use this term for a set of food designed for long campaigns. For the Vikings, this was their own ancient equivalent, a meticulously planned system where everything was interconnected. Salt, a preservative; smoke, an antiseptic; fat, an energy source; dried meat, a protein base. All simple, and therein lies the genius. Archaeologists found remnants of barrels and leather bags at ship burial sites near Roskilde and in the Oseberg area. Analysis showed traces of salt and animal fats. These are not just artifacts, they are traces of a strategy. Even at sea, Vikings created a closed ecosystem of nutrition: fire, air, water, and earth. 4 elements transformed into tools for survival. The sensory image of their life at sea can almost be heard: the roar of waves, the creak of ropes, the thud of oars, the smell of salted meat warmed over coals. They ate right on deck, biting into hard, stone-like slices, washing them down with seawater or mead. Each piece was a memory of home, of the smoky ceiling and children waiting for spring. Food was not just physical sustenance, it connected them to the land, to the past, to their gods. According to various sources, on long voyages, Vikings made a special mixture of crushed meat, fat, and berries. It was something between a paste and bread. They called it rakadir, beast's flesh. It could be eaten cold and provided strength even in a storm. This was food made at home by wives and eaten in war by husbands. A preserved tradition states that such a mixture was placed in ritual vessels when sending deceased warriors to Valhalla. Even in death, a Viking did not conceive of himself without food prepared by his own people. These provisions were their armor against time. When a storm dragged ships into icy waters, meat and fat became the last reminder of life. Frost did not frighten the Vikings. Emptiness did. But they found a way to turn the cold itself into an ally. On board, they hung meat directly on the rigging, and the wind dried it even more strongly. Thus, the ship became an extension of their home, a moving smokehouse. Archaeological reconstructions show that the temperature below deck remained low enough for food not to spoil. This proves that their ships were designed not only for battle, but also for long-term storage of provisions. Every crack, every board worked for survival. And yet, even such measures did not always save them. There were years when meat spoiled, when fat turned bitter, and salt was washed away by storms. Then, desperate measures had to be taken. Eating leather straps, ground bones, ashes from bonfires mixed with water. Historians do not hide it. These were cruel times. But it was in these moments that the legend of an unyielding people was born. The sensory finale of this scene is simple. A Viking, sitting by the hearth after a long voyage, chews a hard piece of smoked meat. His hands are scarred. His beard is permeated with salt. His eyes are tired but alive. He has survived everything: cold, hunger, and storm. And in this piece is not just food, but the memory of the journey, of home, of how a human can conquer even the absence of life. And when archaeologists today find petrified pieces of meat covered with a layer of salt, they find not just food remains. They find proof that human strength begins where comfort ends. This is the true secret of the Vikings, their ability to preserve life in a world where everything tended towards death. But behind this cold mastery lies something more than technique. Their ability to preserve meat is a reflection of their philosophy, and to understand how this philosophy changed the fate of the North, one must see what remains of it today, not in museums, but within ourselves. Today, with refrigerators humming in every home and expiration dates on every package, we have almost forgotten that once humans fought decay with their bare hands. For the Vikings, preserving meat was not just culinary art, it was a form of faith, their dialogue with nature, where every smoky piece, every pinch of salt meant a victory over death. Archaeologists say the Vikings' secret is simple: not cold, but balance. Fire gave aroma, salt, purity, wind, dried, fat, protected. All together created a system where nature worked for man, not against him. And this philosophy, based on resilience and respect for the elements, became the heart of the northern character. The image of the last shot, an old Icelander, a descendant of those who survived 9 months without refrigeration, hangs meat under the roof. The smell of smoke is the same. The sound of the wind is the same. 1,000 years have passed, and the recipe remains. The taste of ancient fear and ancient strength. And now, when you open your refrigerator to take out a piece of meat, ask yourself, could you survive without it? Could you live through winter relying only on smoke, salt, and wind? For it was precisely in this way, step by step, that these people built a civilization on the edge of the world and proved that those who are not afraid to look death in the eye can survive. Thus ends the story of meat that survived winter. But in reality, it is the story of a human who conquered time.